The conflict involving the United States, Israel, and Iran has reached a point where Washington finds itself without a clear path to victory. Despite sustained military pressure, Iran continues to demonstrate considerable resilience, launching missiles and drones while showing no indication of backing down from a strategic standpoint. The situation increasingly resembles a losing position for the American side, with no obvious formula for turning things around. A fundamental imbalance defines this conflict. For Iran, the threshold for success is remarkably straightforward: simply endure. As long as the Iranian state survives, it can credibly claim not to have been defeated. For the United States and Israel, however, the bar is set dramatically higher. Their version of victory requires the complete elimination of Iran's ballistic missile capabilities, the dismantling of its nuclear program, and ultimately regime change. These are extraordinarily ambitious objectives, and the window to achieve them is narrowing with every passing week, particularly as the global economy shows signs of serious strain. The question of timing weighs heavily on strategic planners. How long can this military campaign realistically continue before domestic and international pressures force Washington to step back? Much depends on the trajectory of the world economy and how far both sides are willing to climb the escalation ladder. There is little doubt that the United States and Israel are pushing that ladder higher, but every step upward carries severe risks. One of the most dangerous potential escalation points involves oil infrastructure. Should American or Israeli forces strike Iranian petroleum facilities, Tehran possesses both the motivation and the military capability to retaliate against energy infrastructure across the Gulf states. These Gulf facilities represent what military planners would describe as a target-rich environment. Iranian strikes on them could send catastrophic shockwaves through global energy markets, with consequences that would be felt far beyond the Middle East. Interestingly, even hawkish American political voices have expressed discomfort with Israeli strikes on Iranian infrastructure, signaling a quiet acknowledgement within Washington that provoking Iranian retaliation against Gulf oil facilities is a risk too large to accept casually. This tension between American and Israeli strategic preferences is becoming increasingly visible and will likely grow more pronounced as the conflict drags on. Beyond oil, Iran holds another devastating card: the desalination plants that provide drinking water across the Gulf states. The Middle East is largely desert, and these facilities are not only vital but also highly vulnerable. Iran possesses accurate short-range missiles and a substantial drone arsenal capable of targeting these installations with precision. Destroying them would not merely damage economies, it would threaten human survival in affected regions. This gives Tehran what strategists call an assured destruction capability, the power to inflict irreversible harm even while absorbing punishment itself. What emerges from this analysis is a strategic picture deeply unfavorable to Washington. Iran is not disappearing. It cannot be bombed into submission based on anything the historical record tells us, and its retaliatory options remain potent, varied, and credible. The United States entered this conflict without a winning strategy, and as the weeks pass, that uncomfortable reality is becoming harder to ignore or explain away. The current predicament in Iran draws uncomfortable but unavoidable parallels to earlier American military misadventures, most notably Vietnam and Afghanistan. Those who argue that the United States simply needed a different approach, a smarter strategy, or fewer restrictions on its military in those conflicts are engaging in revisionist thinking that does not hold up under serious scrutiny. The hard truth is that no magic formula existed in Vietnam, none existed in Afghanistan, and the evidence strongly suggests none exists in Iran today either. During the Vietnam era, some of the brightest military minds in America gathered constantly to debate how the war could be won. West Point cadets, career officers, and senior strategists poured enormous intellectual energy into finding an approach that would deliver not just battlefield success American forces consistently won individual engagements but genuine strategic victory. That solution never materialized because it did not exist. The notion that a different set of tactics or a longer commitment would have changed the fundamental outcome is a comforting illusion, nothing more. The same logic applies to Afghanistan. After 2 full decades of military presence, the United States could not produce a stable, self-sustaining outcome. Suggestions that staying longer or fighting differently would have reversed that result misunderstand the nature of the conflict entirely. These were wars that could not be won in any meaningful sense, regardless of the resources committed or the strategies employed. What makes the current situation in Iran particularly sobering is that even sharp, experienced analysts who examine the conflict carefully cannot identify a credible counter-argument to the conclusion that this campaign is failing. When informed people genuinely try to steelman the case for an American victory and come up empty, that absence of a convincing alternative is itself a powerful signal. The Trump administration appears to be arriving at this same uncomfortable realization, having moved past the early confident assertions about swift regime collapse and stunning military achievement that characterized the war's opening phase. Running parallel to these strategic failures is a broader and deeply troubling development: the systematic erosion of respect for international law and international institutions. The current American administration has made clear through its actions that rules-based multilateral frameworks are obstacles rather than assets. This attitude extends beyond foreign policy. Domestically, there is a visible pattern of disregard for institutional constraints, whether legislative, judicial, or legal in nature. When a government operates with this level of unilateralism at home, its dismissiveness toward international norms abroad should surprise no one. What has genuinely shocked many observers, however, is Europe's response, or more precisely, its absence of one. European nations have historically positioned themselves as custodians of international law and defenders of multilateral institutions, yet faced with actions that clearly violate established legal norms, including the attack on Iran and the assassination of senior Iranian leadership, the European response has been largely one of accommodation. Spain stands as a rare exception, having maintained a principled critical stance while most of its neighbors have chosen appeasement over principle. This European capitulation carries consequences that extend well beyond the current conflict. Every instance of silence normalizes the next violation. The architecture of international law, built painstakingly over decades, depends on consistent enforcement and vocal defense from those who claim to believe in it when it's most committed. Traditional defenders go quiet. That architecture weakens in ways that will outlast any single military campaign. The damage being done to global institutional frameworks may ultimately prove more consequential than the military outcomes in Iran itself, leaving the world measurably less governed by rules and more governed by raw power. For years to come, the question of whether ground troops could resolve what air power has failed to achieve is one that military planners and political strategists are increasingly forced to confront. The historical record on this point is unambiguous. Regime change through aerial bombardment alone has never succeeded. If the objective is to fundamentally transform a government and replace it with something more favorable, boots on the ground are required. Yet a large-scale ground invasion of Iran, comparable to what the United States undertook in Iraq, remains essentially unthinkable given current political and military realities. Iran is not a small or fragile state. Geographically, it rivals the entirety of Western Europe, and its population of roughly 93 million people represents an enormous human reservoir of potential resistance. The idea of subduing such a country through the kind of sustained punishment inflicted on smaller, more confined territories is simply not feasible. While significant damage can certainly be inflicted on Iranian civilian infrastructure and the broader population, the historical evidence consistently demonstrates that civilian populations subjected to mass punishment do not typically capitulate. They endure, they adapt, and they continue resisting. Iran's own modern history reinforces this point powerfully. During the devastating 8-year war with Iraq throughout the 1980s, Iran absorbed casualties estimated between 250,000 and 500,000 dead. The country did not collapse. The government did not fall. The population did not revolt and demand surrender. This was a society tested by industrial-scale violence, and it held together. Anyone constructing a strategy premised on breaking Iranian resolve through punishment needs to reckon seriously with that historical reality before committing to such a course. Beyond the question of resilience lies the matter of nuclear incentives. One of the most significant and underappreciated consequences of this conflict is the powerful lesson it is teaching Iran and every other nation watching closely. Countries that pursued nuclear weapons, North Korea being the most obvious example, enjoy a level of security that non-nuclear states clearly do not. Iran, having refrained from crossing the nuclear threshold, now finds itself subjected to exactly the kind of military campaign that nuclear deterrence would have prevented. When this conflict eventually concludes, the incentive for Iran to pursue nuclear weapons will be stronger than at any previous point in its history. The strategic outcome could therefore leave the region and the world in a considerably more dangerous condition than existed before hostilities began. The ripple effects extend well beyond Iran's borders. Across the Arab and Islamic world, anger is mounting, directed not only at the immediate military campaign but also at the ongoing humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, which continues despite receiving far less international attention now that the Iran conflict dominates headlines. For citizens of Gulf states in particular, the current situation raises profoundly uncomfortable questions about their relationship with Washington. These are countries that have hosted American military infrastructure, aligned their foreign policies closely with Western preferences, and built economic relationships premised on American security guarantees. Yet it is precisely that alignment which has now made them potential targets of Iranian retaliation. This dynamic is quietly reshaping regional geopolitics in ways that will persist long after the guns fall silent. Saudi Arabia had already begun diversifying its security relationships before this conflict began, reaching a significant strategic agreement with Pakistan that extended nuclear deterrence guarantees to Riyadh. Turkey has expressed interest in joining that emerging alignment, recognizing that American reliability can no longer be taken for granted and that a nuclear umbrella outside of NATO structures may serve its interests better. Former Israeli officials have made statements suggesting that once Iran is dealt with, Turkey could become the next focus of Israeli strategic pressure, an observation that has not gone unnoticed in Ankara and has accelerated Turkish interest in alternative security arrangements. What is unfolding beneath the immediate noise of the military campaign is a fundamental realignment of how nations in the broader Middle East and Islamic world calculate their security interests. The United States is not merely failing to achieve its stated military objectives, it is simultaneously undermining the network of relationships and implicit agreements that gave American power in the region its durability and depth. That is a loss far harder to recover from than any single battlefield setback. The domestic political consequences of this military adventure are beginning to crystallize in ways that should deeply concern the Republican Party and the administration that launched the conflict. Public opposition to the war was striking even before the first strikes were carried out. Approximately only 1 in 5 Americans supported military action against Iran before hostilities began. That figure rose somewhat once fighting started, as it invariably does when any nation enters armed conflict and patriotic sentiment temporarily overrides strategic skepticism. The rally around the flag phenomenon pushed support to roughly 40%, but that ceiling is now showing cracks, and the trajectory from this point forward points consistently downward. What makes this conflict politically distinctive is that no modern American president had previously taken the country to war against such pronounced pre-existing public opposition. Previous administrations invested heavily in building public consent before committing forces. The Bush administration's case for the Iraq invasion in 2003, however misleading in retrospect, was constructed carefully enough to generate initial public support exceeding 70%. That support eventually collapsed as the true costs and consequences became undeniable, and today the Iraq decision is widely regarded by diplomatic historians as the single greatest foreign policy blunder in modern American history. The Iran campaign began with far weaker public foundations and is deteriorating from a lower starting point. suggesting the eventual political reckoning could be even more severe. Within the administration itself, coherent strategic thinking is difficult to identify. The individuals closest to the president on the most consequential portfolios, Iran, the Palestinian situation, and the Russia-Ukraine conflict, are figures whose qualifications for such responsibilities are genuinely difficult to defend. Handling three of the most complex geopolitical challenges simultaneously requires deep institutional knowledge, diplomatic experience, and strategic sophistication. The people currently entrusted with these portfolios possess none of these qualities in meaningful measure. Their profound personal commitment to Israeli interests further compromises their ability to serve as honest brokers in negotiations where Israeli behavior is central to the dispute. Among senior figures, the vice president stands out as someone likely capable of recognizing the strategic bankruptcy of the current approach. He is widely regarded as intellectually serious and perceptive enough to read the situation clearly. However, his own future political ambitions create powerful incentives to avoid any open confrontation with the president, leaving him in a position where private reservations cannot translate into meaningful course correction. The remaining architecture of foreign policy decision-making offers little reassurance that sober counsel is reaching the Oval Office in any consistent or impactful way. The Israel lobby, long one of the most formidable forces shaping American Middle East policy, is also navigating genuinely new territory. Public awareness of its influence and its role in pushing Washington toward this conflict has grown substantially, because the war is visibly failing to achieve its stated objectives. The political protection that unconditional support for Israeli strategic preferences once provided is eroding. A potential open rupture between Washington and Tel Aviv over how and when to pursue an exit from the conflict could accelerate that erosion dramatically. American officials appear increasingly interested in finding a face-saving off-ramp. While Israeli leadership continues pushing for deeper escalation, a divergence that, if it becomes fully public, would expose the lobby to scrutiny it has rarely faced so directly. Ukraine's position has deteriorated further as a direct consequence of this conflict. American military stockpiles are being depleted by Middle East operations, sophisticated air defense systems are being redeployed away from East Asia, and the political bandwidth required to sustain meaningful support for Kyiv has been consumed by more immediate crises. Meanwhile, Russia's economy receives an unintended boost from elevated global energy prices, strengthening Moscow's capacity to sustain its military campaign indefinitely. The net strategic effect is a significant transfer of advantage toward Russia at precisely the moment when Ukrainian resistance requires maximum external support. Looking toward the November midterm elections, the Republican Party faces a gathering storm of compounding difficulties. Economic pressures that were already building before the war began. Inflation, affordability concerns, stagnating household finances have been intensified rather than relieved by the conflict and its effects on global energy markets. A war that is neither won nor ended by Election Day, combined with economic conditions that continue deteriorating, represents a political environment in which historical patterns strongly suggest significant losses for the party in power. Should Democrats secure substantial congressional majorities, the prospect of a third presidential impeachment becomes a serious political possibility rather than a distant theoretical one. What emerges from this comprehensive picture is a situation in which nearly every variable, military, diplomatic, economic, domestic, political, and strategic, is trending in an unfavorable direction for Washington. The honest assessment, however uncomfortable, is that outcomes are more likely to worsen than improve. The war that was launched with confident predictions of swift, decisive success has instead delivered a masterclass in the dangers of strategic overconfidence, historical ignorance, and the catastrophic consequences of allowing ideological commitment to override clear-eyed analysis of what military force can and cannot realistically achieve.